I'm talking with Professor David Fraser, Professor of Law and Social Theory at the University of Nottingham, as well the author of the book Honorary Protestants, The Jewish School Question in Montreal, 1867 to 1997. And I want to begin by asking you, Professor Fraser, what was the Jewish school question?
The Jewish school question was more than one question, but it was the series of issues which arose by the fact that Section 93 of the Canadian Constitution guaranteed educational rights in Quebec and in Montreal in particular to Roman Catholics and to Protestants. But of course there was no mention of what was to be done with the Jewish children who began arriving in Montreal with the sort of influx of immigrants. The families wanted to send their children to be educated, but as we know, there were no public non-denominational schools in Montreal. There were only Roman Catholic and Protestant schools. So the Jewish school question was, what do we do with all of these Jewish children who want to go to school?
At that time, were the Jewish people paying school taxes?
Some Jewish people were paying school taxes because school taxes were levied on real estate holdings. So the longer established, wealthier Jews of Montreal were paying school taxes, but the newly arrived immigrants who just got off the boat and made their way to Montreal were mostly living in rented accommodation, and renters didn't pay school taxes.
What happened, I think in 1903, there was some sort of a Provincial Education Act?
Yes, following the Pinsler case, when the Superior Court in Montreal held that Jewish students attended Protestant schools only as a result of the Christian grace and favor of the Protestant school board, this was seen to be not an acceptable situation for thousands of children to be put in. There were negotiations between the Jewish community representatives and the Protestant school representatives with the intercession of the provincial government. The 1903 Act essentially said that for educational purposes, Jews would be Protestants.
How did all of this affect the Jewish community?
Well, it affected the Jewish community in many ways. Their children were able to be educated in English in the Protestant schools with accompanying difficulties, which the book looks at. And it led to a long series of interventions and discussions and conflicts and resolutions, especially with the Protestant school board, with municipal governments in Montreal and in surrounding suburbs like Outremont, for example, and with the provincial government.
What kind of difficulties did the Jewish students find in these schools?
Well, the Jewish students always ran up against a set of resentments from the Protestant educational hierarchy. One was the school tax question, that their parents, because they were poor and were living in rented accommodation, weren't paying school taxes. So the argument was always that Protestant taxes were subsidizing Jewish students and that was essentially unfair. And they also found a series of issues around questions like release from study on high holy days and being allowed to absent themselves from the sort of religious Protestant part of the school curriculum, and this always created problems.
During this time, was there a question or possibility of a separate Jewish school board?
There was agitation, especially in the East End among the newly arrived immigrant and Yiddish-speaking communities known as the downtowners, as opposed to the uptowners of the more established Jewish section of the Jewish community. And there was a great deal of agitation for setting up a separate Jewish school board to run in parallel with the existing denominational Roman Catholic and Protestant systems. This eventually ended up in the Privy Council in London in the late 1920s in the Hirsch case. And the Privy Council said that it was perfectly permissible to establish a separate Jewish school system in Montreal.
What about the Quebec government? Were they willing to go along with it?
The Quebec government, unfortunately, was heavily influenced by the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church did not want a third system of education. They didn't want especially a third system of education which was not Christian. And so as a result, mostly of a combination of the agitation by the Roman Catholic Church against the creation of a separate school board and an ongoing belief in large and important parts of the Jewish community that it was better in the long run for Jewish students to go to English-speaking Protestant schools in order to become Canadians.
When the Jewish students were attending the English-speaking Protestant schools, were Jewish people allowed on the Protestant school board?
No, absolutely not. This was the other big bone of contention. The Jewish parents who won in 1903 the right to send their children to Protestant schools thought that as citizens in a democracy, where their children were being educated, that they should have the right to sit on school boards and to determine the ways in which their children's education took place. The Protestant school board was consistently opposed to this, and unfortunately for the Jewish community, the Supreme Court and the Privy Council in the Hirsch case made it very clear that as a constitutional law matter, Jews could not sit on the Protestant school board.